All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to start out by going down and asking them all to introduce themselves and apologize for not using East cons. No, that's not on the agenda at all. I gave mine away. No, I'm going to ask them all to introduce themselves, talk about their experience in the committee, and what they see as their personal role. The committee is made up of an awful lot of people, and some different people have different roles they perform. We're going to ask them that, and then I'll ask them kind of a few other kind of general questions, but the point of view is to kind of prime the pump so that you guys can come up and ask questions. Do we have an audience mic? Here we do. We have an audience mic. All right.
We need those up here so we can throw them at you.
Yes. Kate, can you sit in the front so we can throw at you better? All right, so while those are coming up, let's go ahead and we'll just start right here. And I'm going to ask you, introduce yourself, tell us about where you're from, what your experience is, but particularly what's your experience on the committee, and what do you see as your personal role in the committee? What is it that you're trying to accomplish?
So my name is Louie Teon. I started attending committee meetings in ISOCPP, I think in 2016, and now I represent Amazon on the committee. Mostly my interests in the committee are mostly around lambdas and constexpr and compile time programming in general. So I also follow the reflection effort a lot. So basically what I do is I sit in the evolution working group, which talks about the language evolution, so new language features and how they interact with the vision for the language. And I prepare proposals that are going to bring us forward with respect to reflection and compile time programming. So lots of papers with expanding capabilities of constexpr and that kind of stuff.
Cool. I'm Roger Orr, and I spend most of my time sitting in the core working group, where we're looking at the proposals that come out of evolution and dotting the I's, crossing the T's, trying to detect some of the places where there are inconsistencies, incompatibilities, ambiguities, getting the wording right, so that what ends up in the standard, all the implementers will make the same decision about how your program will decide, in theory. Most of the people in core actually write compilers for a day job. I don't. I sit and use C++ in my day job, but I'm a contractor, so I just take a week out and disappear off to a meeting of C++ people. But I'm also the head of delegation for the BSI. The way that WG21 works is that all the people who come are representing some national body. Obviously, many of them are the American national body, ANSI, but other national bodies too. And there's an increasing number of people who represent the BSI, some of whom actually are resident in the US but are British citizens and represent the BSI, and I'm trying to kind of make sure that I keep a track as well on all the things that are going on, so that if there's anything that someone in the BSI cares about, we make sure that somebody's in the room to put the British Standards Institute view forward.
Can I ask you one question here?
Yeah.
Would you be up to talking a little bit about the structure of the committee? You guys have referred to evolution and core. Can you give us, not all the study groups, but the high-level structure of the committee?
Yeah. We meet together. There's the last meeting, there were just over 120 people present, which is a lot. So anything we do with 120 people together, 1 minute is 2 man-hours, right? So it gets quite expensive. So we need to parallelize. And so what we do is we've got, depending how you draw it, top up, top down, whatever, there's 2 groups, core working group, library working group, who you could describe as gatekeepers. They take the proposals and then kind of refine them and work on wording. They also work on defects, bugs in the standard, places where implementers have come up with different views, or no one's quite sure what the wording really means, or special cases that we didn't think of when we were putting the wording together, and no one knows what should this component do under these circumstances, or interactions, that sort of thing. And then below those, you've got the corresponding evolution group. So there's evolution working group and library evolution working group, and they take proposals for new features, for changes, they discuss them, they kick them around a bit, they argue about them, send them around for revising the wording, look at how they fit with other papers and proposals and existing stuff, and try and end up with something that's a consistent kind of design, but they're not always very good at wording. So they do need the extra stages for the core and library people to get the stuff really properly formed in a way that it can be read and understood when people are away from the meetings. In addition to that, you then got, it's now 16, although some of the study groups are no longer active, that are really focused groups, the most active of which has traditionally been SG1, which the hint is in the name, it's the first one, which does concurrency. Things like parallelism, threading, some of the atomic stuff. Various groups have appeared over the years. One of the biggest active ones at present is SG14, which has been mentioned here at least once. We've actually had a meeting on Wednesday night, because some of us were here, which is, well, it was kind of started out life as games, but it covers games, low latency, virtual reality, kind of soft real time sort of stuff. And again, these study groups will look at proposals that are really of interest in that particular niche area, and then feed them through to the appropriate either library or evolution. But they've been kind of road tested by people who are experts in that particular area first. Is that enough of a...
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Lisa Lippincott. When I'm at the meetings, I spend most of my time with the library group, but I make exceptions particularly for the subgroup, for the study groups on numerics and undefined and unspecified behavior, and particularly undefined and unspecified, where we are trying to make the language have more solid semantics. And many of you, I think, saw a lot of my dreams for the language earlier this morning, so I won't go into that. And in the meantime, I've worked on a lot of smaller proposals.
I'm Daniel Garcia. I joined the committee in 2008, so 10 years for now, and I am representing the Spanish national body in the committee. Actually, I'm the only person from Spain for now. I sit most of my time in the evolution working group with some tapes, short tapes to concurrency working group, and also to undefined behavior. And besides that, these days I'm quite involved in one proposal for adding preconditions, postconditions, and assertions to the language, hopefully for C++20.
Here's Michael. My name is Marshall Clow. I work for Qualcomm. I chair the library working group. So we were responsible for basically the back 2/3 of the standards, and almost 1,000 pages. And we spend our time looking at proposals that other groups have passed to us and making sure that the words are correct, that basically none of the people who implement standard libraries can read this in more than one way. That's one of the things we really want to avoid, is when Jonathan implements something one way and Stefan implements something a second way, and I implement something a third way, and they all behave differently. That does not serve users well at all. So that's the thing we really try to avoid. And so sometimes we get issues that are like, look at this wording and it's like, what do we want this to say? You know, we want people to get out of it? Okay, how do we say that so it's unambiguous? But yeah, we spend a lot of time looking at proposals that have already been vetted by somebody else.
Go ahead, Michael. And
can you maybe just keep going? I just arrived. Okay, so I'm Alistair Meredith. I'll give you the warning. My very first standards meeting was 2003. There was an ACCU meeting conference, immediately followed by a standards meeting. And I thought, oh, wow, they're both together. Why shouldn't I go on and do this other thing? And unfortunately, the habit stuck. So you have been warned. These meetings are kind of addictive once you get going. They're a very good training ground if you're a reasonably senior developer. It's very hard to get good material for good training, and attending the standards meetings keeps you right at the top of the game and current on that. I'm Marshall's predecessor as the library working group chair, and with that off my back now, I can finally get round and mingle with a lot of the other groups again. So what I tend to be doing in the standard these days is something between glue and lubricant. I'm trying to clean up the interaction between a lot of the different features and bring the whole thing together. And as per my talk this morning, I kind of see myself as the garbage collector of the standard, trying to move the stuff through deprecated and out again.
I'm Jonathan Wakely. I work for Red Hat on the GCC compiler on the standard library. So as one of the implementers of a standard library, I spend most of my time in Marshall's room, going through the library wording, making sure that my implementation will do the same as everyone else's, and when we're processing the defects, representing my users and saying, no, it's that wording that we all disagree on needs to do this because that's what my users expect it to do, and everyone else says, no, my users think it does this, and then we figure out whose users win or what compromise we can have. I think my first meeting was the same one as Alistair's. It was the Pear Tree Roundabout, the meeting then, wasn't it? Yeah. I stuck around for a day or two after an ACCU meeting. Didn't go to another one for 10 years, but in the meantime, I'd joined the BSI with Roger and had been participating on the mailing lists remotely, just not attending the meetings. And then the committee came back to the UK, so I came to a meeting here where I think the library group were meeting in the basement after the ACCU meeting in a very dark room. I was like, this is brilliant. I'd love to sit in a basement for a week. So I've been to most of the meetings since then. But yeah, I spend most of my time stuck in the library room representing my implementation and my users.
So, Michael, can you tell us a little bit about what you see your role on the committee is? That's what we would ask people.
I think it's like, what's my role on the committee? Okay. So you guys, some of you guys probably know me. I'm the chair of SG5 and SG14, and also a member of the Directions group. I guess I've been doing this for about 15 years now, and probably considered one of the older people in the group. I love it so much that, well, I used to work at IBM, but now I love coming to the UK so much, now I actually work for a British company. And so that's why coming to the UK has become quite a habit. Because of that job switch, I've changed my focus, my research focus towards now primarily looking at how to marry heterogeneous devices, GPUs, FPGAs, distributed devices, off-node device computing, to expand ISO C++ in that area. I feel it's long past time that C++ moves forward to that area, to an area that's pretty much been well explored now, and so that you can at the very least take advantage of all the MIPS that's on your machine. It's a shame that C++ cannot do that yet. So that's going to be the theme of my talk. But my other role, I think, is that since I've been coerced into some of these other activities, is to kind of, because there's so many people coming now, there are over 150 people, many of the people here. I think they're looking at us, at me, to help guide some of the organization, the directions of the group. I think C++ have always been moving along in a kind of a Brownian motion. Whoever is pushing the hardest kind of pushes it one way or the other. There's been a wish recently that we have a more concerted direction with C++, so that we have. It's almost like setting out a 5-year goal or 10-year goal, and we've done that in a recent paper. So I look forward to the kind of feedback that I could get from you guys. Specifically, take a look at P0939, which is a directions group document that we just put out. So I think that's what I'm kind of doing right now.
All right, thank you very much. So let's start at the other end and go this way. And my question this time is, what is the biggest misconception or maybe most common misconception that you run into from people who aren't on the committee about what the committee is about?
I think that's an easy one. I might steal everyone else's answer. The biggest one I see is people saying, why doesn't why isn't this in the standard? Why doesn't the committee do this? As though fully formed designs and proposals just appear out of thin air, or as though we all have nothing better to do 365 days of the year than sit down and go, XML parser, that's what's not in the standard, and and add new stuff. Things happen in the standard because somebody wants it to happen, and they write a paper, and they research the area, and they propose it to the committee, and then the committee spends time looking at it. In theory, nothing gets discussed at a meeting that hasn't been a proposal sent to the committee before that meeting. So we don't just get together in a room and go like, anyone got any ideas what we should work on this meeting? So yeah, if you want something in the standard, propose it. You need to write the paper or convince someone else to do it, not just complain that, what are the committees spending all their time on if they haven't added database support yet? What are they doing? Nobody's given us a proposal to work on.
I would like to follow that up with, and writing a paper means actually specifying things. The standard is really more than anything else, it's a specification for the language in the library. And so if you want a new feature to be adopted into the standard, it needs to be specified exactly what this feature is. Is it a language feature, a library feature? Is it both? How is it supposed to work? What exactly should it be?
So you're suggesting that my proposal that just says we should have an XML parser in the standard is probably not helpful, is what you're saying.
You could write one of those, and it would be given all due consideration.
Yes, you may be asked to go back and try again.
Yeah.
Okay. You wouldn't be told to go away, but
say,
we like the idea. Please expand the paper. And sometimes that's a good way of getting people to go away and come back when you've got more. Can sometimes be a way of saying you haven't tried hard enough.
Actually, if anybody wants to write a library specification for a sizable chunk of functionality, I encourage you to read Howard Hinnett's date-time calendar proposal, which we just adopted. It is an excellent paper. It specifies a lot of stuff in a very precise way. It also is 80 pages long. Yes, it helps very much that Howard has implemented the standard library from scratch, at least 3 times.
So again, I'm probably just going to amplify what's already been said, but a common misconception is that we, as software developers, we've got a set of skills, and we know how the set of skills for developing software works, and we think that's the same set of skills for developing how the standard works. But the standard is not a piece of software, it's a specification of the software we're going to produce. So it's similar to saying, I know how to write C++ code, therefore my development skills are great. You get into the world of metaprogramming, you're a meta level here. The specification is your meta over your implementation. And it tends to, it's similar. You intuitively are using a lot of the same process, but it's also different in a way that's hard to encapsulate, to describe until you're in the process and then you feel it. So, but assumption that why aren't you just following a simple, we know how to release software, we know how to iterate. Well, we don't have the ability to iterate in this town. We do a new release every 3 years, and it's either perfect or we've got problems because we can't ship the patches. So this is part of the nature of trying to build that specification with the pressure of getting it as close to perfect, which we can never do, but as close to perfect as we can every 3 years now.
Does anybody have a misconception that we haven't talked about yet?
I'm going to try one. People ask me on the standard, oh, it must be very cool to go to to 3 meetings a year in diverse places and see all these cool places. And so my first standards meeting was in Kona in Hawaii in 2012, I believe it was.
Did you come back with a sunburn?
And so I got there and I took a picture and I sent it to my boss and I titled it Neener, 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 I'm in Hawaii and you're not. And the picture was basically a room like this. Doors, a big room filled with people with tables in front of them, laptops, no windows, doors shut. And we go from 8:30 in the morning till 5:30 in the evening, and then from 7:30 till whenever, for 6 days. And then you're like, I'm in this great place. Oh, I'm tired. I just want to go home. And so, yeah, this is not a junk it by any stretch of the imagination.
So, one misconception that I have found several times when talking to people has to do with the decision-making process. So the things that's not working away, you just propose something, we vote yes or no, and who gets more votes, you are done. It's basically a process of achieving consensus. And one of the reasons, of the many reasons for that, is that when we finally have a draft international standard, we open a process at ISO where different countries vote, and you need a very strong support from the nations to approve the standard. So the only way to get there with some hope that things will go well is that during the process we not make decisions by simple majority, but we try to achieve real consensus. And this sometimes has as a drawback that we might go a bit slower than some would like, but it has as a very strong advantage stability.
Okay, I think I'll take a somewhat more technical one. I often run into people who wonder, why do we leave so many things undefined or unspecified in the standard? And the answer really relates to his answer. The standard is an international treaty governing the use of C++ around the world. And that treaty binds different people in different ways. The way in which it binds me as a user of the standard library is different from the way it binds Marshall as an implementer of the standard library. And so every freedom that I give up becomes a freedom that he gets or that the compiler authors get. So it's a give and take that that we only put in the requirements where we really have to get along.
On a similar line, I think what I pick up is people who say, why can't you fix X? Because it's obvious what the fix ought to be. And most of us are used to programming in a particular ecosystem where an awful lot of the code follows similar sorts of patterns. And then you move somewhere else and they do all this weird stuff. And things are declared differently and used differently. And you look at the code and you think, is that valid C++? Goodness me, I had no idea you could put that keyword there. And in the standard, we've got to make sure that we support all the different paradigms. And in particular, a lot of code now is auto-generated. And so code that a sane person would never write, a tool might go off and generate. And so we have to make sure that if you make us what appears to be a fairly innocuous change to the language to make it straightforward and simpler, may break all sorts of unexpected things in unexpected ways. You know, the language is really, really complicated. I mean, that's just history, the way it goes. So making any change is difficult.
One thing that I sometimes come across is people think that we're like gods of C++. And it's not really true. The language is so complicated, so large, right, that we actually all have our own, parts of the language where we know more. Like I know a bunch of stuff about lambdas, for example, because I wrote some proposals where I modified the wording for lambdas. So now I know that part of the standard. And I know a little bit about const expert because I've touched that as well. But many parts of the standard I have absolutely no idea about, right? Or, I mean, roughly, but no more than that. So, so even if you are not an expert in, every part of the language, it doesn't matter. You might actually have some, ideas to contribute, or you might have, come across use cases or patterns that are actually useful and probably not even known by people on the committee. So I guess I want to send a message that you should not feel intimidated by the people on the committee. Even though there are some, lots of people with a lot of creds, there are also like people that are just normal programmers. I consider myself like that, really.
I actually try and amplify that. A common misconception is that there is anyone on the standard committee that actually understands the whole language.
Other
There
than
is
Richard.
not.
Other than Richard.
You got more questions?
Actually, I do have one question, and then can I have a show of hands? Anybody has a question right now? I just want to see where we're at. Not a lot of questions yet. Okay, a couple. Okay, I'm going to ask one question. I'm not going to put anybody in a spot. I'm not going to ask everybody to answer this, but I was just wondering if somebody wants to share a story of some language feature that you have used in your work from 17 that was kind of a surprise. It's like, wow, I'm glad that feature was there, and maybe it's something you didn't work on, and so it's kind of a surprise. I hadn't thought too much about this, but now that I'm doing this. Anybody want to? Jonathan.
Light up. Okay, yeah. I was not expecting to like if constexpr as much as I did once I started using it. Partly because there'd been a lot of controversy about static if as a sort of an earlier similar proposal that has some overlap, and that had gone down in flames and raised a lot of people's ire. If constexpr came along as a smaller, simpler, and I just sort of ignored it and was like, okay, it's a language thing, I'm a library guy, it'll go in, I'll learn about it as I need to. And then the first time I started using it, I realized that as a library implementer, it saved me half of the number of overloads I had to write. Because you don't have to do tag dispatching anymore, you don't have to do specializing. It's just very convenient. And yeah, it sort of hit me out of nowhere. I wasn't expecting to like it as much until the first time I used it, I suddenly went, well, that's awesome.
Anybody else have an awesome story to tell us?
I guess I'm finally awake enough to talk about something. So for me, I started looking much more closely at parallel STL, and I think that the addition of in C++17 of parallel STL, it might seem like it's just a minor tweak to the algorithm, such that now you can do things in a print parallel and potentially parallel vectorized, but therein lies probably one of the most powerful speed up in C++17. With very little code change, you can essentially get yourself anywhere from 10 to 30% potential speed up, and maybe even vastly more, depending on the kind of hardware you have. Right now, the design is such that it will keep stepping down if you don't have vectors or things like that. What's even more is that parallel STL, because I'm so involved in this area now, is actually the demon's door. It's opening the door now, potentially wide, towards the ability for us to add all these other things that's coming, like executors, like affinity, and therefore in time, starting with parallel STL, C++17, you'll come back and look at it and say, that's the first feature that will start bringing in things like heterogeneous computing and distributed computing. Sorry, it took me so long to wake up. I forgot your question previously.
Anybody else? So we can, let's throw it open. I think, Matthew, you had a question? Yeah. Was there an audience microphone somewhere?
On the other side.
Actually, our experience is that sometimes the answers are long. If you have a question, would you mind just coming over here and kind of getting in line? That way we'll know who's next. Would that work? So if you have a question, come over here and form a queue. I feel so British.
Okay, do you hear me now? All right, great. A practical question. I liked Alistair's comment about the fact that going to C++ meetings was something that was very insightful for him and following what's happening. But my question is very practical, is that how to get sponsorship for that? Because obviously, I guess the easy answer is that your company pays for it. But if you don't have that option, what could you do?
You know, I didn't ask you how much the committee pays you guys to...
Bountiful amounts.
That's the simple answer, get a new job.
So many of the people on the committee are sponsored by their employers, and so they end up, you know, it's just another week at work. It just happens to be somewhere else.
Harder.
harder than a normal week of work.
harder and longer than many. There are several people who are their own employers and they send themselves. And then there are some people who just show up because that's what they want to do and they decide that that's a good use of their time and their money. Finding someone to sponsor you, it seems that the employer is the overwhelming choice. And if your employer won't do that, I don't know what to tell you. I know what Jonathan will say, because he's already said it.
Yeah, it can be tough to convince an employer that sending you away for a week to not do your job for a week is good for you and the company. 3 times a year. Some people manage it. Some people do convince their employer that, hey, look, I'm meant to be the C++ guy here. It would be good for me and therefore good for the company if I go. But I think more people end up going because they actually have something they want to change. They want to get better support for polymorphic lambdas, or they want context to work in new places, or they want to add a library feature. If you have something where the language is holding you back in your job, and you can get the start of a proposal. I mean, Marshall said a proposal needs to be a specification. The first draft of the proposal doesn't have to be, the standard of the standard. It can be a bit rougher, and people will help you get it in shape. But if you can write a proposal and then convince your work that, hey, look, we can't do this because of this language thing missing, I'd like to go to the meeting and try and convince them to add it. And a lot of people come to their first meeting because they want to add something. Often they stick around because after they've convinced work once, it's easier to get the budget approved or whatever, or they just really like it. But yeah, I think if you've got a thing that you want to get into the standard, that's a better way to convince someone to pay for your flights.
And depending on where you are, there may be a gateway drug available. For example, in the UK, we have the BSI C++ panel, and we meet 6 days a year in London, and people typically start by maybe coming to that for a day, and then you're at one remove, but involved in the process, and occasionally there are people who, like Anthony Williams, who was here, he sometimes dials into those, but people can pass papers round, and then somebody else who's going to go to the meeting could then present your proposal. And again, many of the national bodies have something that means people can meet in a slightly less, the whole WG21 environment.
I would specifically address how I got lucky on this was, yes, I turned up paying my own budget out of my own vacation because it sounded like a fun thing, 2 standard meetings a year at the time, travel the world, week of C++ with the experts is fantastic. You actually get to enjoy doing your technical stuff, and a week touring wherever we were. Then they put in more and more meetings, so I lost that. But I'm hooked in the process. So for 7 years, I was happy to do it off my own budget. I genuinely enjoyed going. But I was lucky that when I was now ready to look for a new employer, an employer saw me there and said, we want somebody who's doing this. So I happened to be in the right place at the right time. I can't guarantee lightning will strike twice. But if you're already in the process, it's easier to find an employer who will want you to maintain that tradition that now is luckily no longer on my vacation budget. I get a real vacation every year.
So, kind of related to that, I want to ask a question, and I guess we can go right down. All of you can answer, or maybe you can just pass, but has being on the committee made you a better C++ programmer?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe I should say, how has being on the committee made you a better C++ programmer?
So one thing is, because we spend usually more than 3 weeks, right? Because we work on our own writing proposals and stuff, but at least 3 weeks per year, really focusing on the standard and the standard library in some cases. You get to know the standard library really, really, really well, right? And you also understand why some design choices were made. So in my case, I'm pretty young. I don't have a lot of experience, so I get to see very senior people how they design stuff for the library, for example. And why they are making the decisions that they're making. So this is a really useful learning experience, at least for me.
And vice versa. And the other way around. Yeah. Because you have new ideas.
One of the other things that is a definite thing you learn is you now know some other people you can ask those hard questions of.
So networking makes you a better programmer.
Yeah.
Knowing who to ask when
Knowing
you
who
have a
to ask.
problem.
And also, one of the things that's always struck me about my involvement in WG21 is that the vast majority of the people who come to the meetings are really humble and approachable and are happy to help, which is great. It's not always what you find when you ask questions on the internet, I've found.
Yes, and I'm going to say that yes, for me, a great deal of what I learn is sharpening my wits against the wits of the others there, because in more general contexts, I sometimes have trouble going head to head with people on fine details of design, but there's nothing but going head to head with people on fine details of design in the standards committee.
For me, definitely, it has been very, very positive. On one hand, you know, you go to the committee and you are able to interact with very smart people, and I have learned a lot from many of them. And on the other hand, also it's quite refreshing finding young people with new ideas, with things you never thought about. So definitely I have learned a lot.
Yes. No, it's actually, I think for me, it's made me a terrible C programmer, because now every time I look at C, I think it should be done to C++. Seriously, guys, I mean, this is really the best education, bar none. I mean, I don't want to put down the learning tree or anything like that. I mean, I realized very, very early on that nothing else in the world compares to coming to the C++ committee to learn something from the best in the world. Yes, you do get a lot of infusions of young people coming in. I was that person 15, 20 years ago. I remember when Francis Glassborough was there, and I was the youngest person. Now the roles reversed. I'm now the oldest person. I was the annoying person coming up with all these ideas. And now other people are annoying me with all the great ideas, like you. He's actually on my Canadian delegation. So it's great, and it's great in that way. I wanted to key on something that Alistair said. For years, he came to the committee. I knew that he was kind of paying his own way. A lot of people do that. And in fact, if you can't find your way in, you start that way, and you might find your way in by some other means. Okay? For years, he was annoying me with his ideas. In fact, I thought he picked on me because I was the Canadian delegation. So, why? Because we have a nice reputation. Until I realized how smart he is, and I thought, wow, this is a great person to really work closely with. And indeed, I now have working relationship pretty much with everybody on stage here, and many of you guys sitting down as well too. And I have to say that's probably the best rewarding part of my career. Finally, the last thing is when I wanted to change jobs or needed to change jobs, this makes it so easy.
I would like to say one of the most rewarding experiences I had, I remember distinctly, was the first thing I worked with Michael on was inheriting constructors. And the main reason I hooked up with Michael on this was it was such a dumb idea. It could never work. And I hit him again and again and again with all the reasons why it could never work. And he kept fixing it. And suddenly I thought, oh, I actually quite like that now.
Hey, was he annoying? Good work, though.
So to go back to the original question, yes, I think being on the committee has made me, well, maybe not a better programmer, definitely a better engineer. I'm much more aware of the importance of speccing things out and following the specs and making sure that it's very clear both in the specification but in my mind what I'm trying to do. And the necessity for writing code that is very clear and unambiguous, along with the specs that are clear and unambiguous.
Or maybe testing it even.
What?
Or maybe even testing it. At some
Maybe
point.
even testing it. Occasionally, sometimes. But yes, I have minions for that, right? I wish. Yeah, anybody want to be a minion? Come see me. You get these cool buttons, but I have no money. Anyway. yeah, and the ability to, look around and ask people questions, people who've been doing this for a long time, or people who have very different experiences for you. It's great, because there's a lot of people who are very smart and have strong opinions, and mostly we can sit there and disagree all day and then say, oh, yeah, you want to go get a beer? Okay.
Yeah, very similar to what Marshall said about understanding the importance of a clear spec and following that and knowing where the sharp edges are. C++ has a lot of sharp edges, and if you just start programming blindly, you're gonna get into trouble eventually. Maybe you can get away with it on one compiler, but you start using two and things blow up. So from working on the standard, I became the guy at work that people go and ask questions about, not just the library that I actually worked on, but the compiler tells me this is undefined because there's no sequence point. What on earth does that mean? And I became the guy who could answer those questions because I'd been looking at the stuff in the standard. And then it did get me a new job by coming to a meeting off my own back, as Alistair did for years. I came to one in the UK. I think since working on a compiler rather than just working on the standard in my spare time or as a part-time, I've become a worse programmer. I don't write programs anymore. As a standard library implementer, I don't write anything longer than about 20 lines, a main, and it might call one function. It's just unit tests. And I write the standard library, but that doesn't do anything. It doesn't have any output. It doesn't make anything appear on a screen. It doesn't. I don't actually write software anymore, unfortunately. So go on the committee, but stop at some point. Don't then go and work on an implementation.
The other part of that is because the committee goes to various places, there's a good chance that there will be a meeting near you where you can attend for less than flying 10,000 miles. And if you're funding yourself to see if you like it, it's much handier to say if there was a meeting in Bristol. That's a lot easier than a meeting in say Kona. So in June, Peter's waving his hat. In June, the committee is going to Rapperswil in Switzerland, which is not that far from here. And then next fall, I think it is, there will be a meeting in Belfast. Again, not that far from here. Of course, I'm from the west coast of the US, and from my perspective, all those places are like this far apart.
I will say it's very helpful to know that your only cost is making sure you can get through the door. There's no direct cost of attendance itself.
All right, Sergey.
Do you think that there is a chance to get rid of the UB unsigned overflow? I mean that having it as UB is harsh. I am just multiplying two unsigned shorts, and my hard disk can get formatted. I don't like it, and I guess that so are most of application level developers out there.
So you were asking, are we going to define the behavior of
signed overflow?
Signed overflow.
What should it do? If the value doesn't fit in the type, there's no good answer.
Implementation dependent, at least. At most, two complement. But even implementation dependent will say, at least, so I will get garbage, but I won't get my hard drive formatted. Phew.
Implementations do have flags to make that happen.
It means that I'm writing the compliant code, potentially. I don't want to. Last cause.
Yeah.
At least two major compilers said that there will be two complements forever and ever. GCC and Plant have this behavior, but it's not standardized. So why not? Okay, say implementation dependent, I will behave.
This is a case where, was it Roger said that, someone says, why don't you just fix this? It's obvious what the right answer is. But it would hide bugs. In some people's code, they do not want, a very large short times a very large short to give a small short. And the ability of the compiler to flag that with an undefined behavior sanitizer or to give you a warning at compile time, because if the standard specifies what it should do, the compiler just has to accept your code and be like, well, that doesn't look right, but it's supposed to produce a very negative value. I'll just do what he says. You know,
But if it's
it's not always obvious that that is the right thing to do.
if it's implementation defined, then that wouldn't prevent a compiler from saying the way we implement this is by warning you when you do this.
Yeah, yeah. Implementation defined doesn't make it any more portable, though. Implementation defined, you know, if you're saying you want to write something that's portable, you've now got to check what the definition is on every implementation.
I'm fine with it. I just don't want to have my hard drive formatted. I think it's fairly reasonable because there are lots of population in dark places of code which nobody will care if they will go wrong. Like I'm logging something. Okay, I don't care whether it is correct, but having hard drive formatted is a little bit too hard for such a.
There is a type which will avoid it and will give you 2's complement behavior on a 2's complement machine. If you use unsigned integers, you get the modulo behavior that, you know, I'm not saying that that what we have today is perfect. There are problems, definitely.
If I'm using unsigned, then I'm running into all kinds of problems with signed and signed mismatch, which is even worse than that.
Yeah.
So the whole thing is, the whole type thing is badly broken.
Yeah.
Inherited from C. And well, I would be happy to switch to all signed, but and actually that would be probably the best thing because unsigned are well risky in another context. But the only thing which prevents me from doing it is that unsigned, that undefined behavior on
Overflow.
on
Yeah.
side overflow, which is, I think it's way too harsh punishment for such a minor infraction.
I agree it's broken, but the solution is not obvious or we'd have done it. And just saying, implementation defined doesn't actually help anybody. What we really want is big nums or big ints, and the numerics group are working on that, where you can do something that is not going to, is either going to set an error bit. Clang and GCC now have functions which can do safe multiplication, and if it overflows, they'll tell you.
This goes against zero cost principle.
Yeah, but so does defining it to something, because now you have to check if it happened. There is no perfect answer.
Yes.
If you think there is, write a proposal saying why it's this.
Lisa, give us the perfect answer.
There is a petition by C++ developers to get 10,000 signatures under. Okay?
Yeah, we're aware of the problem.
Yes,
If you know the solution, tell us, write the paper.
this was actually there was a paper in the numerics group, and I think it was also discussed in evolution at the Jacksonville meeting, which included this problem. There were arguments on both sides, of course, but there were several strong arguments, I think, against making the simple change, one of which is we're very sensitive to leaving any space for other languages, and particularly C, to be to have faster implementations than C++ does. And
Is there any kind of, well, because implementation development has nothing to do with it.
yes, but undefined behavior does have something to do with it. Undefined behavior is freedom for the implementation. And
Are there any tests which demonstrate that this thing has ever brought any difference from regular flows?
yes, there are definitely optimizations. I know of some in Clang, and I'm fairly certain that they exist in other compilers that do significantly improve speed of some code in some cases. And it's not, sorry?
Is there any paper on it?
A paper.
So
JF Bastion has a paper of what you're talking about, talking about the treatment of unsigned and overflows.
okay. I'm not sure that specifically mentioned the optimizations that we're talking about here, though. Yes.
the compilers don't put optimizations in if they don't help with the spec benchmarks generally. And compiler implementers are obsessed with the spec benchmark suite. And and it has a lot of issues because it means that they just focus on these 40 programs. But if they're doing something like that, it's because it helps with concrete benchmarks on a program that a committee has accepted. The spec group has said, this is representative of real C++. And then compiler writers go to town trying to make that particular thing as fast as they can, because then they can say, we're 0.1% better than this other implementation on this benchmark. So yeah, there are real numbers on real programs where this has been shown to matter.
Yeah. And I will say that discussion around the table in Jacksonville seemed to indicate that we do understand a better solution. But we don't understand a better solution that doesn't involve using a time machine to get there. If we could go back in time and correct the mistakes that were made many years ago, we could probably have a much better language in this regard.
And I think one of the things that did make progress in Jacksonville is fixing the case where you have mixed signed and unsigned operations. I think that is going to get
Yes,
better.
I think we did make some improvements there.
Yeah, I can't remember the specific details, but the topic of this dangerous corner is not being ignored. It's just that making changes that are definitely better is very hard. It's not always obvious where the right fix is.
All right. Next question, yes.
Speak into the mic. It's a very simple question, really. Where does it end? Is there anything that is out of scope, off limits, that you wouldn't accept or change in the core or in the library?
One of the things that the direction group is there for is to try and keep the kind of rationale of C++ alive. C has a rationale that's kind of published. C++ has a rationale that's kind of a bit amorphous. Biana has specified bits of it over the years with both his books and also his presentations, and others have tried capturing it. Several of the national body heads participated in a document a couple of years back where we tried to capture on paper some of the things that made C++. So phrases you might have heard, the sort of zero overhead, you don't pay for what you don't use, as much as is possible. And trying to get that down and trying to get the direction group, which is sort of 5 or 6 people who try to make sure that the language has a coherent direction. It doesn't change the kind of flavor of the language. But hardware changes, environment changes. So things will need to change, but it's knowing, how to do that in a way that's consistent with the high level design of the language itself. Does that help at all?
Well, it says it almost says anything goes as long as it doesn't cost somebody an existing feature, it doesn't add cost to an existing feature.
Well, it's trying to make clear if someone put forward a proposal for something that changes the runtime cost of things, everything in C++, and made everything 5% slower.
Sure, but what about a new kind of switch statement that does pattern matching? You can reject that?
No.
We've had a proposal for that.
We have proposals in flight on some of those things. So there are quite a lot of directions that things might go in. And partly it's down to what proposals we get, because we don't just make them up. Someone has to produce one.
There's nothing if you go, they're saying it's open pending.
Well, to address that, and trying to figure out what's beyond the pale. I had notions in my head of what was beyond the pale one day. I never expected that we would adopt a standard that would bind to an external database of international time zones. That seemed completely beyond the kind of thing that could land in the standard, yet we did that at Jacksonville. So my horizon has to be pushed out much further than I expected. But try very hard not to break existing code. That's a boundary we don't want to cross. Although we always edge over it a little bit, but we're not going to make a radical break in any one time. but it's a creeping boundary.
Implementing rules.
Yeah, I think this is a fair question here, in that this is what the direction group is trying to say, and we have set what it's supposed to be. Everything is inbound unless it breaks some of the fundamentals. So some of the fundamentals I quote from the paper says a direct map to hardware, zero overhead abstraction, which was also mentioned. C++ is essentially a way to allow us to bring that together and allow us to support modern hardware, better support for modern hardware, and a more expressive, simpler, and safer abstraction mechanism. Now, with those guidelines, many things could come in, and one of the principles that the direction group is trying to do is to give guidance to the chairs to not just read every paper, because the problem is it's with 100. Each mailing is well over 100 proposals going out, even at a modest length of 10 pages each. That's almost 1,000 pages that you have to read in order to get any sense. And it's untenable. It's also eating up time in terms of the priorities of the committee towards certain directions. So I think one of the things that the direction group is asking the chairs to do, at their discretion of course, is that they focus on the priority as specified within those guidelines, and with proposals that are outside of those guidelines, push them down, or at some point, if they keep coming, in fact, they should not come back unless they have had substantial changes. We're not going to start looking at proposals over and over again that have minor changes. So these are things that we're trying to do to streamline it. Now, if the other part of your question, which when I first heard it, are you asking is where does C++ end? That's a different answer. If that you're asking, will C++ ever end?
No.
Okay.
The library, for example.
But I do have an answer for that. Okay. C++, like any other language, will die. Yes, you heard it. At some point, it might not die in one shot. It might morph into other languages. But very few languages, if you look at the history of programming languages, have ever actually really survived more than 20 years. C++ is doing great at almost 30 years, and in fact, it's overdue. And part of the reason it's able to stay alive for so long is because we've been morphing it into a new and better language each and every time. These changes that we're putting in is almost effectively making C++ a new language. At some point, it's going to groan under the weight of all this stuff.
At some point?
Yes.
Especially if we don't.
We'll be looking forward to that day.
Especially if we don't get rid of the horrible stuff like overflow.
Right.
Undefined things. There's a lot of C legacy that is holding us back as we add new stuff. Just on the specific topic of pattern matching, I think Bjarne himself had a proposal on that several times. So Bjarne Stroustrup wants that. Lots of people want that thing. But yeah, with the number of proposals we get, if the proposal isn't fully formed or implementers have concerns about the practicality or the performance, it may be that it doesn't get through the committee. It doesn't mean that we'd say like pattern matching in C++, get out. You know, we are not doing that. It just means that the proposal that we've seen so far to add it hasn't been high enough priority, good enough, or better than the other things on our table.
It's actually in the direction group document. Pattern matching is actually in there.
Yeah, lots of people want it.
Yeah.
Francis, did you have a question?
Just this chap was waiting.
Oh, I'm sorry. I missed you. Okay. Thanks for helping out.
So my question is whether the ISO process has any kind of forced quality control. Because I was scanning the open issues list and found quite many defect reports which were pretty old, like some over 5 years. And still open and not even having indication that work actually happening. So without any progress.
Were you looking at the library issues or the core issues?
The core issues.
I was prepared to add to a library issue.
Yeah. No one else from core I can blame. Yes, there are a lot of issues. The word of power is implementation divergence, which means someone raises an issue with the language and says, when I try it on this compiler, I get one answer. When I try it on that compiler, I get a different answer. And those are more important. We care about those more. There are quite a lot of open issues where the wording isn't right, we don't know how to write it correctly, but all the
Don't know how to
compilers
write
do
the
the
wording
same thing.
correctly?
We don't know how to write the wording correctly. We know very often what we intend.
We know what we mean, and the compilers do that.
And the compilers do that.
But we are questioning if the wording is an accurate description of what we're saying.
Yeah, so we've got various priority levels internally when we look at an issue. So P0 means, yes, it's blindingly obvious, we know how to fix it, we just need someone to volunteer to write the wording. And then P1 is, we need to fix that, it needs thought. And so we'll discuss that at a face-to-face meeting. P2 and P3 will differ. Either they're a really, really minor corner, or it's a really big, difficult issue. We don't even know how to fix it, but it's not going to break the world. And like everything else, we've only got a finite amount of time, so we're trying to prioritize the issues that actually cause grief in the real world, which is why some issues, but occasionally issues just get stuck. You know, somebody volunteers to do the wording and then they change job. And we may not necessarily, get back to that one as fast as some people might like.
And wouldn't it be possible to at least write in that defect report list that we did prioritize the information that you just said, that it had a triage, and you determine that it is not it is an issue, but it is not a high priority issue.
Yeah.
If it was written right there, then we would know that it happened. Now I see only that the issue is there, that it is acknowledged as an issue, and nothing happened.
Yes, some of it is internal because it's got like names of people who are going to be working on papers. We don't want to make that necessarily public, but I think the active list of what priority things are in is available. We maybe don't do as good a job as we should of explaining what the various categories mean. So that is something I'll look at to see whether there's a way of making it clearer to people who aren't coming to the meetings but still care about broken language features.
Yeah, I think the core list is a bit more, because the core group and the library group have their separate issues lists, and I think the core one is a bit more opaque. I think there's even an internal version of it which has the assignments for drafting on, and so the chair of the group knows who's on the hook to write wording, but that's not in the public version because he doesn't want everyone's, emailing Richard going, why haven't you done the wording for this issue? He's volunteered to do it, give the guy a chance to write it, sort of thing. The library group does a similar prioritization thing. We have 0 to 4. And we try to put more notes in the library issues list. There is more sort of, we looked at this in Kona, everyone agrees, X, Y, Z. We just need some wording. And there's a bit more history. It doesn't mean it's going to get resolved any quicker. You can just see that maybe we talked about it. And then a year later, we talked about it again. And then a year later, we couldn't remember what we talked about, so we bumped it down a priority. And we've got thousands of issues, or hundreds still open. And so a lot of the time, it's, implementation divergence matters. If someone cares about it deeply and they're willing to push it and keep bringing it up again and write the fix. If someone's willing to take a stab at writing the fix for the wording, even if it's not right, it gives us something to look at the next meeting and go, I see what he's trying to say, but that's not how we'd say it. And then you've kind of nerd sniped us and we'll be like, yeah, it should be like this, da-da-da-da-da. Whereas if we just get a blank, there's no suggested fix, we're like, next, we'll look at another one.
If you write the wording really well, your issue will just bump to the P0.
Yeah, so for library, P0 means not just we know what it wants to do, but it even says exactly what we want there, and we literally just rubber stamp it, and it goes in the next draft. But someone has to write that.
Yeah, P0 is, it looks great, get it off our plate.
Francis.
Before I ask a question, just a comment. World economics has effect because the C++ committee can only change things if it's got the expertise to understand. And we have a case of that back in the 1990s when there's a lot of tags in the 98 standard for numerics work, which had to be abandoned because the experts were no longer being financed by their employers. The experts were people like those from Cray, and the financial stringencies meant they could no longer send their experts to do the work. So before you want to make dramatic changes to the standard, you need to get a body of experts who understand it well enough to explain it to other competent programmers. Now, my question is, when I was a regular member of WG21, the average meeting varied between about 45 members if it was in Tokyo, and perhaps about 60 if it was in Hawaii. You can work out why the difference is. These days, the committee has become much larger. And I'm wondering if the people sitting on the being grilled could comment upon how that has changed the ethos of the committee, the way in which the committee works. In my day, everybody knew everybody else, and everybody knew who was competent and who would have to sit in the back and just follow what was going on. And I wonder now, with the many study groups and attendance now over 120, how that has affected the interactions, the social side of developing a standard.
It's a great question. As you hinted at, the study groups and the working, there are a lot of different groups now. It used to just be 3. There was the evolution group, the library and the core, and now we've got a library evolution on top of that, and then the 16 study groups. So it's true that not everyone knows everyone. There are some people who turn up and they'll stay in one of the study groups the whole week. And there are study groups that don't necessarily come to the meeting. SG14 does more does more stuff outside the committee meetings than they do inside. And so a lot of the people who are very active in SG14 aren't coming to the meetings. There are some who are active, like Guy, who's coming to the meetings and active in SG14. But it's certainly the case that there are people who are writing proposals that are then coming through SG14 that the old committee guys have never heard of. And if they were at a meeting, we wouldn't recognise them, we wouldn't know them. I don't know how much I don't know how to judge how much it's changed the ethos, but it wouldn't surprise me if there's a bit less trust in terms of, I don't know who this guy is, and where did this paper come from? Which isn't maliciously the case, it's just that you can't know 120, well, I mean, there were probably 200 people involved and 120 of them come to a meeting. You can't keep up with everyone and every proposal. I think we do see more sort of like, what's this rubbish, or where did that come from, which we should try not to do.
Well, it's just human nature.
Bad,
if you know the person who writes a proposal, you're going to think better of that proposal. Well, you may think worse of it, but if you're a human being, you're going to have
it's like when you deal with someone over email, and a colleague at work, and you're like, this guy's an idiot, and you meet them in face to face, and you're like, I get where you're coming from, and then after that, you can picture them, and you're like, he's not that much of an idiot. We just didn't line up our views, and once you've met someone in person, you can see where they're coming from a lot better.
So I think I'm glad you mentioned this, because I want to refer you back to P0939, section 6.1. The word is trust. And this is exactly the kind of differences we're seeing now. From the time when I came in, and I was a junior programmer, and you were there, and now I am kind of in your place. Not that I could ever actually replace you. But we discussed this extensively at the DG, and we felt that we definitely felt that there was a lot less trust in the committee. So in the past, with 40 people, a proposal percolates up through multiple committees. By the time it gets to plenary, for the most part, there was not as much discussion as today. So that's either good or bad. Okay. Today, there's a lot more discussions, and what's worse is that some things are getting shot down in plenary, in full group, when just one person raises an issue, which might have been discussed or may not have been discussed. Maybe they didn't get the satisfaction that they want. So one of the things that, if you look at the DG 6.1 on trust, it will say something like that you really should think about before you raise your hands in plenary. And indeed, in plenary, they're trying really hard to restrict it so that It's nothing technical that has not been brought up before. So one of the things that they will say is lack of comfort is not sufficient to block a proposal. And indeed, it is normal now, as Jon said. There's a lot more lack of comfort right now because you didn't shepherd the proposal through. You weren't involved in it for much of its lifespan. You may not even have heard of it until it got to plenary because you were so involved with your proposal. And some people are maybe inclined to say no or wait and see until I have a full view of it. The fact of it is that that's just going to delay things, and so I think the committee is going to try to urge that to not happen.
It is easy to hear that the committee came up with this valueless by exception. What the heck were they thinking? Maybe when you really look at it, you say, well, that is maybe the best of several bad solutions, right? But out of the blue, it's easy to say, wait a minute, what are you guys thinking of it?
I was going to comment on valueless by exception, but let's not.
Yes, that's not. Yeah.
Because I was going to say another way the committee has changed is, again, 2003 when I joined up, the committee was small enough. You tended to intermix with a lot of the other working groups over the lunch and the dinners, and a lot of committee work was essentially done by that networking between sessions. And as the number of people attending has grown, and the number of papers has significantly risen, the amount of work we're trying to get through has grown. A lot of those lunchtime meetings are now spent much more within your own silo, trying to focus on the work you're trying to get through for this meeting. It used to be the evenings, we go out there and maybe there'd be an evening session or two, but that was a good time to catch up with what the other groups are doing. There's now not just one evening session happening every evening, but with all the study groups we've now got 2 or 3 sessions every evening for the whole meeting. So the ability to intermix with this bewildering large group of people now, and your ability to embrace and learn the faces, is distinctly impacted. Yep. And it's just a lot of hard work now.
And you just can't follow what's happening in 7 rooms at once. People in IRC are saying, this group's looking at this paper, this group's, and there's no way one person can be like, yeah, okay, I'm glad that's progressing. You can only focus on 2 or 3 groups at once.
Yeah. I want to make sure we get our questions in. We're in the yellow zone. So who's?
So I also have a question that goes like with regards to the increasing workload with the number of proposals. So of course there's always like these big proposals that add exciting new features, but I'm wondering is there also a demand for like really small proposals that fix like small things? Like for example, I recently stumbled across, like I was using the read-write functions on the I/O streams, right, which take char pointers. And I was wondering, now that we have std byte in there, shouldn't they take a byte pointer instead? Like it's a really small change. It's not broken or anything. It's just like it might make it more consistent. Would there be room for like such really small changes, small proposals?
Those are the ones that specialize in.
Yes, there is, and they often go very well. On the core side, we've had a number of very small proposals, very tightly focused, that have just come through and gone through fairly straightforwardly. So things, for example, that you can now have an initializer on an if. So if initializer semicolon condition. Very, very tightly focused. Actually, I think it's brilliant. But it was somebody noticed it, thought about it, discussed it, came up with paper, good wording, and it came straight through. So yes, there is room for small proposals in both the language and the library.
And I'll add that the job of the study group is to look at big proposals that might be outside of the expertise of the committee. Transactional memory is a good one in that case. But the small proposals has a place. The DG guidelines specifically talks about the small, any fixes that will improve the language. Evolution now is more talking about small proposals that can get through in that way. The other thing I want to finally mention, I know there's a lot of background experience here, is that when we got together and wrote that P0939, we felt that it was important to give guidance to this large group, kind of what Francis is alluding to, by talking about what it takes, what you should be thinking about pre-prepping when you're trying to write a proposal. One of the things that came out of it is that you should really read D&G, direction and evolution, D&E. Now I know that it's out of print, and in fact, if you try to go on Amazon right now, in the UK, I think somebody's trying to sell it for £900. Okay? Maybe he has taken. I would like to find out if it's that. But I think what we've been trying to do is get it either reprinted or accessible. And I urge, if you're trying to put a small proposal, even if it's a small proposal, which I'm no longer involved as much as used to. But when I came in, I put in a lot of small proposals because I definitely see from that side now. I'm in a different space, but look at D&G, sorry, the D&E, sorry, and look at the DG document. And then if after reading all that you still think that your proposal should go in, then by all means put it in. And mostly it will either be evolution or library evolution that look at those things. Yeah. If it's a giant proposal like change the world on multi-threading, that's going to be a study group. But on that, we have specific guidelines. We don't generally encourage changing the world proposals because C++ changes incrementally, and even if you're trying to change the world, it will change incrementally. I'm trying to change the world by adding heterogeneous computing, but I'm doing it step by step, small, medium proposals, one at a time to get to that end goal. I'm not trying to, in one shot, change the whole memory model, the whole abstract machine. That is a no-go right from the beginning.
All right, Guy, are you next?
Oh, sorry, we're done.
It's been really great. Thanks a lot, everybody.
He's in SG14. He gets a shot.
I get to speak. Yes. Yeah, don't worry. I'm not going to talk about graphics.
Ouch.
No, I was going to ask about the sheer quantity of papers that comes through. Jacksonville was my second meeting, and many papers went unattended. And I know the importance of being present to attend the papers, and obviously, decisions have to be made. I didn't really understand how the papers that went through were actually chosen to be presented, or what makes the cut? How does something make the cut to be discussed, and how does it just end up at the bottom of the maybe pile?
That's not at all obvious, even to me, and I get to set the direction for many of them. Part of it is that before every meeting, we set a set of goals. What do we want to accomplish at this meeting? And papers that help accomplish that goal tend to get put to the top. One of the things for the last meeting, the goal was advance the parallelism 2 TS to, PDTS to be able to send out to balloting. Okay, one of the gators on that was PO, I don't remember, the SIMD paper, which was huge. Okay, and so library spent the first chunk of the week, a day and a half, on that paper because it met the goals of the meeting, right? If we don't get through that paper, the parallelism 2 TS doesn't go out for balloting, and it's got to wait another 3 months. And then we just have to do it in Rapperswil. So that's the first stuff off the top. And then it's things that I think are of higher interest tend to go to the top, but there's always a whole bunch of little papers, little focused papers that I put in a stash. And anytime we have a few minutes of committee time, let's look at something. Let's look at this. Let's look at this. Because we have half an hour before lunch because we just finished one paper and this looks like a half-hour paper. Let's go. But I wish I could tell you that there's this deterministic algorithm that I crank through, but there isn't.
I suspected that answer, but I just had no clue.
I will give my experience at the latest meeting, where I have a small paper that's proposing a few extra traits in the library, is layout compatible, and other things. And that advanced through core because I was there and ready to go when core had 15 minutes and no other paper would fit, and my paper was small. So that's a way to get things through too.
Being in the room makes a difference.
For the little ones, it can just get slotted in somewhere. Marshall doesn't see a paper usually until it's been through library evolution, and I know the previous chair of library evolution did start a sort of voting mechanism where a few weeks before the meeting, he would ask people to he'd list all the papers, and it was a sort of Web 2.0 thing where you slide things up and down. So there was a cut-off, I think say you had 40 papers, there'd be a top 10, bottom 10, and middle 20. And you'd sort of slide these all up and down and like, oh, I don't care about that, or I hate that guy, or whatever. And he'd then collate, he had the software that ran this would collate everyone's answers, and it would hopefully become clear that, well, everybody wants to see variant, nobody's very interested in yet another paper on allocators. And that, you know, that's a voting, there's a sort of runoff thing, and the top, I think the ones that ended up in the top 10 would definitely get on the schedule. The ones that were in the bottom 10, I don't know if Titus has continued this, the new chair, but he would basically say, we aren't going to look at them, you know, we've got too much. And then the middle 20 would be, we'll try and look at them, you know, enough people are interested in it that it didn't end up at the bottom. I think that was pretty good because it was sort of democratic. You'd get a bit of consensus before the meeting even starts on what do people want on the schedule. Because otherwise, if the chair just looks at stuff and goes, nah, I don't like that, you know, it could be that everyone else in the room was really looking forward to seeing that paper come in. But that's just one of the groups. The different chairs judge, you know, they set their own schedules.
That's not a bad thing. All right. We've got another question.
I apologise beforehand, and please feel free to ignore the question. Why wasn't the first study group 0?
Because SG1 is Stargate. It was Stargate fans.
All right. Well, we've probably got time for another question if somebody has it. But I'm gonna ask us all to thank the panel very much for taking the time out and sharing their thoughts and opinions with us. So thank you guys very much. I also want to thank you guys all for your questions and your patience and understanding and occasional snarkiness. That's always to the best. So thank you guys for coming in. Anybody have a last word? We've got 4 minutes. Anybody have a last word they want to share? Recruitment for the committee?
Yeah, send us your small proposals. Reading into byte arrays sounds good.
If you want to directly get involved, one of the easiest ways is take a look through the library issues list. If you see wording or a way to resolve these issues, send an email to LWG Chair, and we have this little demon called Daniel Krugler, who does an amazing job of keeping that list up to date as the emails come in. So even if you can't attend the meetings, you can help progress and resolve a bunch of these issues. We need manpower to just help process that large list now.
I wanted to also point out that, Daniel is great, but the other thing that he will do is if you send in wording, he will improve it. and then he will send it back to you and say, okay, I've done your stuff here, but I cleaned it up a little. What do you think? And most everybody says, oh yeah, that's better than what I wrote.
And finally, pair up with somebody experienced. Not just us on stage. I see many people in the audience who are regularly attending C++ standard meeting. Peter, that left right in front of me. There's a whole bunch of other people that are participating in SG14 who now have the experience of shepherding papers through. Nothing like pairing up with somebody. That's what I did to get my first few proposals through, and I still find that extremely valuable.
All right. Well, thank you guys very much. Oh. No. Peter the microphone. He wants to say something.
If you propose something, be patient. I have had papers that got into the standard with R0, and I'm currently on a paper that is counting the revisions at least 13 or 14. But it's still hopeful to get in, yes.
Yeah, if you want to work with someone or get something in, just email someone you know who's on the committee. They can point you to the right person. You know, if you email me and say, how do I get this, you know, if I'm not interested, I'll say, talk to this person. But just email someone with an idea and see where it goes from there. Don't be afraid.
And if you don't think you know their email address, you'll probably find it's written on one of the papers they've already authored.
Unless they change jobs.
sending mail to that one.
All right. Well, thanks a lot. I really appreciate it. And guys, have a good rest of the conference.